The Universal Basic Income Coalition is calling on government to urgently clarify its position on the Social Relief of Distress Grant and the Basic Income Support Grant. The UBIC says certain statements by Treasury, which seem to contradict the commitment to expand the SRD grant, are worrying. We're joined by Siyanda Baduza, basic income researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice, to discuss what is being viewed by the UBIC as a lack of transparency on what is actually happening behind the scenes to take this commitment forward. Good evening, Siyanda. Thank you very much for joining us on the program. So government has continually recommitted itself to explore the expansion of the SRD grant or basic income support. But concerns on the so-called double speak in government has been brought to the fore, where the president can speak at the State of the Nation address, recommitting government to this broader program of expanding the SRD grant. Then Treasury comes in with a frank message that the country's high debt and low economic growth simply doesn't allow for the grant. What do you make of all of this right now?
I think that's a very accurate description of what's happening. So for years, the government has been very consistent in their message that the SRD grant, which was introduced in 2020, would be here to stay and would be expanded and turned into like a system of permanent basic income. But I think that there's been a contradiction in the policy there by government, specifically on the part of National Treasury. But I think the most important thing to remember is that National Treasury, even though they deal with issues around the fiscus, aren't the ones that are responsible for developing policy on social grants. That role lies with the Department of Social Development, who have also continued to make commitments that the grant would be made permanent. So what we see is National Treasury essentially usurping the role of other government departments and speaking for government as a whole when that mandate lies with other departments.
But social development in this instance would have to act in concert with other departments that are profoundly impacted by a decision that is taken at a policy level, because social development may have all sorts of concepts, but it must be funded by Treasury. So Treasury would be at the table when such discussions are had as to whether it's feasible. We do have the funds, because unfortunately it will be up to them to raise the funds or perhaps reallocate or decide on the spending priorities.
Well, absolutely. That would, I guess, the financing would lie with National Treasury. But what we're seeing isn't just them speaking on the financing, but actually on the policy development itself, which is a responsibility that lies with the Department of Social Development. So, for example, there are indications that National Treasury is commissioning their own research on ways to rationalize the grant system, while at the same time the department is working on a policy of basic income. So I think while they do play a necessary role in terms of speaking on the financing, once they begin introducing their own proposals, things like proposals in the medium-term budget statements or statements around, say, introducing online-only systems, which we've challenged in the past for being exclusionary, to other grants, which again would be a matter of policy that lies specifically with the Department of Social Development. So I think that there's that tension here, which while they do have the final say on financing, they can't develop policies themselves, which I think is where. Yeah.
I still want to challenge you on this one, because there could be some that argue that if you're saying you've got Treasury now also looking to conduct its own research on the feasibility of perhaps expanding this SRD grant, some would say they're quite proactive in that respect, because even if social development would have this desire to have the SRD grant expanded, what they would do in their research is actually identify the need. That you do have society that is in need of the expansion of this grant, but it would be seen as them overreaching into that which is the function of Treasury if they now went on to explore ways on how it can be funded. Yes, they can put options there, but Treasury would still be required to be the ones that explore how it can be funded through taxing, perhaps a certain bracket in society. So what of those who would have that argument that actually this is Treasury being proactive?
I think that there's a limit to that argument, because I think you take the logic far enough, I guess it would imply that Treasury should be responsible of developing all policy in the country, because there's that tension that lies there, which, yes, they are responsible for commenting on the financing and directing it, but it can't just be then that because they're responsible for the budget, which essentially controls every department, mean that they should. Logic would imply that they should be responsible for all government policy, which isn't the case in a democratic society. That responsibility still lies with the president, it still lies with cabinet, it still lies with the department, who are elected and are given mandate by constituents, not Treasury. So they definitely play an important role, but it can't be that they usurp the role of other departments. There still has to be that delicate balance there.
Granted, there should be no super ministry, but would it be important for government to give clarity on the matter now as to where exactly they are in the process of expanding the grant, given everything or all the concerns that many are raising?
Absolutely. I think one, in terms of like the need for the grant, I think that's been very clearly demonstrated. But I think also now there's a lot of anxiety around the future of the grant because, for example, it isn't actually included in the medium-term budget statement. So there isn't any allocation for it for the financial year starting from next year. But again, this is one of those issues where like the policy has been or stated publicly that there would be a continuation of the grant, but in the actual budget statement, it isn't provided for, which again would have to be a decision that isn't just taken unilaterally by treasuries, for example, to scrap the grant. That would have to be taken by the department, that would have to be taken by cabinet as a whole. So I think right now there is definitely a need to clarify, because as it is, it seems a lot like the grant isn't going to be renewed beyond next year, but that would have to be a decision taken by government as a whole, not just Treasury.
Now, Siyanda, you have held the view that it can be financed through progressive taxation. Can you just expand on this?
Well, we've done a lot of work on financing proposals for, say, basic income and the SRD grant as a whole. So, for example, whereas National Treasury they've been firmly like against the grant, but an example that I'll give on like the possibility of financing is in a court case earlier this year where the IEJ took the department and to court. The National Treasury had argued for years that like any increase in the SRD grant was impossible. It would completely be unaffordable. But you saw earlier this year there was an unbudgeted for and unannounced 20 Rand increase that was just suddenly implemented in April of this year, when the discussions previously had been that any type of increase isn't feasible. So I think it's the financing conversation is difficult, but National Treasury hasn't engaged in it in a way that definitely like provides any evidence for it. So there's just been a lot of assertions that like any type of increase isn't possible. But we have, for example, produced research that discusses, say, 13 ways in which you could potentially fund it, including the introduction of a wealth tax, which also has support among other academics and civil society and even people in government.
Siyanda, thank you very much for your time this evening. That's Siyanda Baduza, basic income researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice, speaking to us.